Welcome to the Clinical Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsors, LIMER Education and ESO, we are able to make science more accessible and understandable.
All right, welcome everyone. See, our guests are trickling in. Welcome to the March 2024 edition, how is it March already, of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club podcast. I want to thank LIMER Education and ESO once again for being our sponsors and for allowing us to be here together. And today, I am still Remley Crow, and I am joined by Tony Fernandez, Jeff Rollman, Michael Caduce, and Dr. Bill Toom. All right. The name of the article that we're reviewing, for those of you who don't have it in front of you yet, is Bag Valve Mask Ventilation and Survival from Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest, a multi-center study. This was published in December of last year in Circulation. And as always, we're going to pair this discussion with an article written by our very own Michael Caduce in EMS World, and the section is called Journal Watch. So I encourage all of you who are listening to check it out, emsworld.com under education and training. I want to thank the audience who is here listening live and those of you who are listening afterwards. Those of you who are here live, you can type in questions and comments and we can bring those into the discussion as we go. This is a really interesting analysis with a lot of important implications for pre-hospital care. So please do add your questions into the chat as we go. And without further ado, I say we kick this thing off. All right, so I think someone can help me throw a link to the article into the chat. But this study was looking at a really important concept in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and that concept is ventilation. But what do we actually know about CPR strategies? We know for lay people, we focus a lot on hands-only CPR, so continuous chest compressions. But we also know that continuous chest compressions aren't enough to generate gas exchange. So when we're talking about ventilation, the continuous chest compression is not enough to generate any serious tidal volume, right? So 30-2 remains the recommendation for pre-hospital professional responders. Although it is unknown whether the breaths delivered during those pauses, whether that be by a BVM, are actually effective. And so that's what the authors of this study took on, this important question of whether or not detectable ventilation occurs during CPR with that BVM in that early stage of the resuscitation. So why hasn't this really been studied until now? Well, one of the things that these authors state, and I think it's really important, is that traditionally our analysis of ventilation has been limited by placing the end-tidal capnography device. When does that happen? That happens usually after we've already placed an advanced airway. So what this study does differently is we're actually going to get the beginning of the resuscitation before the advanced airway placement. And I know I'll turn it over to Tony here, who's going to talk a little bit about the methods, but the way that they did that was quite innovative and opens up a whole new realm of research back on this important ventilation piece. So Tony, without further ado, let's dive in a little bit and talk about exactly where this study took place and how the authors measured this important concept of ventilation.
Yeah, so this was, excuse me, this was really interesting. So this was a secondary analysis of the ROC data set. So as a reminder, and we've talked about this data set multiple times, what a wealth of resources this data set has given to our field. But basically it's 6 sites and they came together. The actual titles are Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. And these sites came together to host and foster EMS resuscitation data And they've been doing it for years. And this data set was not only novel when it came out, but there's been so many abstracts and papers that have come out secondary analyses of this consortium that I think the project is worth its weight in gold. So maybe we'll jump back to kind of the objectives of the study, right? So what they wanted to do was they wanted to use a multi-center study, which they could obtain from using the ROC consortium, to determine the incidence of bioimpedance detected ventilation waveforms during BVM ventilation in a 30-2 CPR cycle, and assess the association between detectable ventilations and outcomes with in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. Now, that's a mouthful, right? And I think a lot of what we need to talk about here as we go through is what is bioimpedance detected ventilation, right? I think before we move any further, we kind of need to set the stage here on how they did this. And the idea was that there are physiological measures that you can obtain once the pads are placed on the patient's chest. And one of the things that you can obtain is called your bioimpedance. And what that is the long and short of it is it's a nice way to be able to empirically detect chest rise at a certain level of ventilation. So they set their monitors to detect a level of 250 milliliters. And the idea here was that they wanted to see in between compressions, right, when they're actually bagging their patients, were they having ventilations that were, one, were they pausing for ventilation, two, were the ventilations actually effective? So that's kind of how they set this trial up. And again, it's a retrospective analysis of data that was already collected. And they limited their analysis pretty substantially to get to a population that they could actually analyze. So they looked at patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest that were assigned to one of two arms. So one of the things that the ROC did was they had a secondary trial where they looked at continuous compressions versus CPR at a cycle of 30-2. This study that we're going to evaluate today is just looking at the arm of that secondary analysis that was the 30-2. So they looked at the 30-2 arm, and they looked at data from June 2011 to May 2015 to get an idea of how often these pauses are happening and how often they're actually ventilating the patient. Now, one of the things they had to do to complete this analysis was they had to limit their data to specific monitors and defibrillators that could obtain this measure, the bioimpedance measure. So they had to limit their analysis to LifePaks. They used a LifePak 12, a LifePak 15, and physio control monitors. Anything other than those monitors were excluded from their analysis. They looked at any non-traumatic cardiac arrest where the patient was at least 18 years of age, and they had to have the recordings for a minimum of 2 minutes for the cycles of 30-2 by the EMS providers. If they were not 2 minutes, excuse me, they were excluded from the analysis. So we have questions there. I feel like that was a lot. So before we dive into the next, I want to the next section, I'm going to jump in with the rest of our panelists to see, was there anything in here that you think we should kind of tease out a little bit more?
I think you hit a lot of the key points here. It is important to highlight the time period of the study. So 2011 to 2015, these data are almost a decade old now. But for the particular topic at hand of ventilation, sadly, I don't think a whole lot has changed. I think, this analysis is still relevant, and it's mostly hypothesis generating. It's leading us to ask more questions, like a lot of good research tends to do. I also think the study setting is a key piece of this. So The Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, ROC, had a bunch of different sites. The sites included in this represented 2 sites out of Canada, so British Columbia and Ottawa, and then some of the bigger cities in the United States. So that was Birmingham, Dallas, King County, Washington, and Pittsburgh. So having that as a frame of reference before we dive further into the methods and results, I think is really important. But this was a really great summary of just, where did this take place? How did they do that? The bioimpedance part is really fascinating to me because, it's something I would have never thought about, that the pads are actually measuring once we place them, but a really useful thing to help see chest rise and fall. So yeah, wonderful. And I do see that we have a question in the audience. As far as not being able to see any questions. So this is just a discussion at this point. There's no questions to see. If you have questions, though, happy to answer those. This is mostly just casual conversation about really cool research. Without further ado, though, let's dive in and talk a little bit more about, I'm curious about their measures because, I'm the numbers, I'm the data nerd. I am very particular about what it is we're looking at. So I think it's helpful to break down exactly what was their outcome. Well, they had several outcomes. What was their primary outcome? And then what else did they look at?
So this is so their primary outcome, right, was survival to hospital discharge. But they had a whole host of secondary outcomes, which I think were really interesting. So they looked at our return of spontaneous circulation at any time. They looked specifically at pre-hospital ROSC, or they looked at ROSC at arrival to the emergency department. They also looked at survival to hospital admission, survival with favorable neurological outcomes, and at hospital discharge. And they looked at favorable neurological outcomes using the Rankin modified Rankin scale score of 3 or less.
So and I think those are all good outcomes. And at the time of this study, automated data exchange was not really fully taking off yet. So this was a lot of work that went into the study, and it does have so much valuable data that it's great that we're continuing to use it for new analyses. So to get these outcome data entered, a human had to go and get those outcomes and link them and put them in this registry so that they could be used for research. So huge kudos to those who undertook this study and made this kind of analysis possible.
Yeah, and I think the the authors, they went above and beyond in some scenarios too. According to their methods, they developed their own computer software system to identify the bioimpedance ventilation thresholds. So they would be able to, the software system would actually go in and identify these, the records where they had a waveform amplitude that corresponds to ventilation of 250 milliliters or more for tidal volume. I thought that was fascinating that they went in and developed their own program just to identify their patient population. Just really cool stuff, and welcome to the future, right?
Totally. And I agree with that. And, we talk so often about concerns around data quality and when something's manually recorded. In this case, it's coming straight off of the defibrillation pad. So this is a really good use of those underlying electrical waveforms.
I think it's important too, as we set the stage, you'd shared just a couple minutes ago, I think it's important to recognize this data is almost a decade old. We almost have to set our mindset of, like, today we live in the iGel, supraglottic airway world. And I think we really have to look back 10 years ago when iGel was something we'd never heard of. And it really was either BVM ventilations or advanced airway, maybe some King tubes in there, but even King tubes less popular than iGels are today. So I think as we sort of set the ground for this study and look at BVM ventilations, we do have to sort of remind ourselves this was pre-iGel time, and we still don't know much as much as we want to know about BVM ventilations, but this really was a bit more of a pre-iGel time.
Agree, and that shift has happened. Go ahead.
You make that sound old, pre-iGel time, for a person who worked with an EOA.
Well, and as you dated yourself there. We didn't call you out.
And as an EMT who was trained in the combi tube, we have progressed in our supraglottics, but I think it's important to recognize that like, even today, we're still doing a lot of BVM. In fact, the American Heart Association standard says that BVM is just as equivalent to whatever supraglottic or advanced airway you're going to use. So I think as we sort of set the stage for this topic, it's still something we don't know as much as we would like to about. So what a great study to start to sort of like introduce the whole concept of not knowing.
Yeah, and you highlight an important shift in practice patterns, and that's something we should always be taking in with the context of any study is, all right, does this still reflect what practice is like today? There's definitely some shifts happening.
I just wanted to point out two key strengths of this study as well. And again, like what both of you were saying, I mean, really great study. And this is terrific that it's not just a single EMS system, but a couple of high performing systems, and we can really see the full gamut of data. So first off, in terms of data, the fact that we could see those survival metrics, I think is huge. I mean, so many of our EMS studies, we might know ROSC or what happens when we drop them off at the hospital, but we have no clue about actual survival and discharge from the hospital. So many of our cardiac arrest patients, I mean, we can pump them full of epi and maybe get a pulse, but if, you know, there's no cerebral perfusion, they're never going to make it out of the ICU alive. And those kind of saves don't really mean much at the end of the day. So I think it's huge that we get this survival data. So really excited to see what they found. And second off, just thinking of the context of this, like what you were saying as well, the greater context is so important. There weren't a lot of iGels at that time, especially in the US and Canada, but the AHA, the American Heart Association, had recently changed their guidelines. Historically, for decades, it had all been about ABC, airway, breathing, and then circulation. And starting in around 2010 was that push of circulation and then airway and breathing. So there was this, not necessarily a de-emphasis on ventilations, but focusing more on the compressions rather than ventilations. So this study is coming at that time when agencies are maybe seeing maybe more bystanders doing CPR, but not doing mouth to mouth, since AHA stopped teaching that in terms for lay rescuers. So this is kind of the background when this is happening, when we're moving from that ABC to CAB.
And I think that feeds nicely into some of the great discussion that's happening in the chat right now. So Steve brings up a couple of important points here, talking about could there be any difference in outcomes with the continuous compressions versus the 30-2. And in this particular study, they limited intentionally to the 30-2 group because they were interested in those breaths being delivered by the professional rescuers. But certainly, you know, a future study would be interesting to see, do the continuous compressions associate with any differences in those outcomes? But for this particular one, it was limited to the 30-2 and really looking at those breaths delivered. And I think it is important context too to think about, well, why would we recommend compressions only? When it comes to a lay responder, there's a lot of barriers to overcome in terms of getting somebody to undertake CPR. And so certainly not to say that if we see better outcomes here, you know, that, oh, we should abandon that strategy. No, there's certainly good reasons to keep some of those strategies in place, particularly for the non-professional responders. And I see questions here also regarding data on the quality of the CPR in the study. And that is a huge, important confounding variable to think about. So I'm really glad that you brought that into the conversation. In this particular study, when we get into the results, we'll show in their tables, they do have a few markers of CPR quality. So looking at the compression rate and a couple of the other markers around CPR quality. So we will definitely make sure to highlight those in the tables as we get there. That's a fabulous question. It doesn't mean they control for everything either. So
if I could just,
please.
I just wanted to comment again that if people are not familiar with the ROC papers, they're worth going back and reading. And particularly there's a paper that just talks about the epistry that they had to create to collect all the data. And that's where a lot of the richness of this comes, is that the hard work that went in there with the data collection that you've talked about. But we can't underemphasize how important that was towards all of the ROC publications that took place, is the strength and the work that they did there. So you can go out and read some really good stuff from the ROC stuff. If you haven't, I encourage you to do. And I want to comment, one of the people in the chat spoke about that there are better ways to measure ventilations now, but they haven't made them out into the field still yet. There's efforts to get them that way, but they're not there yet, or haven't been adopted yet, or people don't know about them. And because anesthesia for a long time does a lot of measure, but some of those measuring devices just haven't made it out to us.
Absolutely. And I think we will see shifts in that over time. So it's something important to keep our eyes on. And speaking of, I know that we're anxious to get into results, but I know, Tony, you still have a little bit to tell us about the analysis. And we should have these methods in our minds. It's important to spend time in the methods on a research paper, even though we see a word like Poisson regression, we probably want to like run away for dear life. But I think it is important just to talk a little bit about what were their analytic groups and how did they adjust for some of those things like Steve mentioned.
Absolutely. So, excuse me. So what they did was they looked at dichotomous outcomes, right? So outcomes with two choices. And they had two groups that they were comparing. They were comparing patients with at least one lung inflation waveform of less than 50% of chest compression pauses. So their first group was folks who had less than 50% of their pauses had a ventilation that met the 250 milliliter cut point. Their second group were patients who had at least one lung inflation waveform greater than or equal to the compression pauses. So they looked at 50 or greater versus less than 50% for their two groups. And they did a couple things. So they looked at their descriptive statistics, as you would in any study. They looked at things like witness status, initial cardiac rhythm, chest compression rate or fractions. They looked at ventilation quality metrics. They looked at the ROSC measures that we talked about, and survival and neurologic measures. So they looked at those independently, and then they ran a regression model. In this case, it was a Poisson regression. We will not dive into the details of that. That is way past the scope of this podcast, but happy to discuss it if you want to email me, and I'm sure Dr. Crow would be happy to discuss it with you as well. And they looked at the model was essentially to adjust for things that like we talked about. So they're adjusting for all of the demographics that we talked about, and they looked in their model. They didn't just look at their primary outcome. They made a composite measure of all their outcomes. So that was interesting. And then finally, they looked to determine if there was a dose response. So essentially between the number of ventilations per pause and each of the outcomes. So they really kind of threw everything at this, including the kitchen sink, to get an idea of what their data are actually showing and what the truth is. In doing so, they lost a substantial number of their population, and we'll talk about that as we dive into results. But before I open the floodgates for the results, I want to open it up to any panelists if we have any other comments or questions about their methods for this study.
Not for me. I think that was a good summary. I'm anxious to see what exactly these authors found, and Claude highlights a couple of the bigger findings in the chat for us. So let's invite Jeff Rollman up. And see, Jeff, how about you tell us a little bit about, first of all, the patients that were included in this study, and then let's walk through some of those bigger findings, and hopefully we'll spark some more discussion about, well, now that we have these findings, what are we going to do with them?
Sure, of course. I'm happy to jump into those results. If we're able to go to our first flowchart, the consort diagram, which I believe is figure 1. Yes, and this figure does a great job of showing all those ROC patients. So the 6 different sites, the patients who we have data on, and this flowchart narrows down our actual final number of participants in our study. We could see that about half were eliminated right off the bat because they were in the continuous chest compressions protocol. So we're just focusing on 30 to 2. So that brings us down to a bit over 7,000 patients. And then, as Dr. Fernandez mentioned, some of these patients may have been using different defibrillators. The EMS providers may have had Zoll or something else that couldn't measure the bioimpedance thresholds. And we know sometimes our recordings don't always work. We don't have the data that we need, so we have to make a few more exclusions to make sure that we can actually collect all of our data. So that brings us to 4,500 patients. And of those, about 1,000 of those actually ended up getting continuous chest compressions, even though they were in that 30-2 group. And then another 1,000 or so, we weren't able to get good data on the signals of those bioimpedance threshold devices. So couldn't really tell when they were getting the actual ventilation. So we now have a bit over 2,000 patients. And of those, about 300 of those only had less than 2 minutes of data. So couldn't really get conclusive outcomes on when they were having ventilations. So we now have a cohort. The final cohort is just over 2,000. So 1,976 patients we're going to focus on for the rest of our study. Just keep in mind that there were way more patients that didn't make it in, so that might affect kind of our generalizability later on. So we'll talk about that at the end. And then now I want to see how this was split up, these about 2,000 patients. And we could see that they split them into those that at least 50% or more of each of those pauses had a ventilation. So we saw that impedance, the bioimpedance on the chest, whereas the other group was less than half of the pauses registered what we think was a ventilation. And it was about 60-40. So 60% of the group didn't have a ventilation in most of the pauses, whereas about 40% had a ventilation in 50% or more of the pauses. And now looking at all these baseline characteristics, these are important things that we know that can potentially affect survivability and outcomes in cardiac arrest. But a lot of these are not so different between the two groups. So age, not so different. Male, a little less likely to be a male in the majority ventilations group, but not necessarily significant. But some of the significant findings that were pointed out in the text were public location, so more likely to be in public, meaning that, not surprisingly, a bit more likely to have bystanders witness the cardiac arrest in those that had greater chance of ventilations, and those that had, ventilation in more than half of the pauses. It was nice to see that our actual timing, kind of our dispatch intervals, those were almost identical between the different groups. But a really big difference was our actual cardiac rhythms. So our initial shockable rhythms. We know that our shockable rhythm patients tend to have much better survival. So we could see that almost 50% more of them had a shockable rhythm, almost 30% in that 50% or greater ventilations during pause group as compared to the other group. And then it was also interesting just to see the distribution of the sites, or 6 different ROC sites. And you could see that some contributed more patients than others, not really huge differences between the two groups. Just noticing that the Canadians contributed a lot of our data, but this was definitely an international endeavor.
And this is an important table to highlight, so I'm glad that you spent the time here, Jeff, because since this randomized control trial wasn't designed to look at this particular question, it becomes an observational study. And so we need to know what was different between these two groups, so that when we get into the modeling strategy, is there something that we need to adjust for or control for? And I think you highlighted the initial cardiac rhythm favors the group that had more ventilations in their pauses. And also the witnessed in the public location, which those things are probably very related, also favors the group that did have ventilation. So knowing this is important as we move into other variables related to this analysis.
Exactly. Thank you. And everything in table 1, those are all the characteristics that are going to be adjusted later on, since we know that these two groups aren't exactly identical. So looking at our actual different characteristics when it comes to our CPR treatments, can see that there at first aren't a ton of differences, but we do see that that time interval is a bit shorter in the greater ventilation group. And then our time to our first compression, maybe a little bit more success with advanced airway, but that some of the biggest things that the study authors point out is really our very last row, seeing the number of ventilations. So this will come as no surprise that those that have more ventilations, so the median number of ventilations was 12, and those that were more likely to have more ventilations as compared to 2. So we're really seeing that pretty clearly distinct differences in our number of ventilation. So we're thinking that that's probably where our big differences are, that 50% cutoff that they made, we could see that that was pretty good at dividing between our median number of ventilations.
And this table also goes back to Steve's question and answers somewhat, although of course not perfect measures, but there is the chest compression fraction and the chest compression rates are measured here. Important finding is that these don't really differ between the two groups. So the quality of CPR was probably pretty similar. And I also think it's important to highlight where there's no difference in the number of pauses. Because my first inclination when I was reading this was, well, maybe it's a case of patients who do better, right? Those who get a ventilation and wake up, of course, they do a lot better. But actually, the median number of pauses was 12 for both of these groups. But we can see that the number of ventilations delivered was very different. And we know that because of how the groups were defined. But just keeping in mind some of these things that don't differ is sometimes as important as the things that do differ.
Absolutely. Thanks for pointing that out, Dr. Crow. And now finally, our actual outcomes or actual results. So the authors do show our unadjusted results at first, but keeping in mind, we already know that things like our initial cardiac rhythm can really dramatically affect our outcomes. And I think it's best to look actually at our second from the right column, looking at our adjusted risk ratios, since those adjust for all those different characteristics that we know can dramatically affect outcomes. And this shows us all of these are very significant findings. Those p-values are quite tiny, meaning that it's probably not just chance alone that's accounting for all these values. And that shows us that there's something there. Even after we adjust for everything else, we can see that pre-hospital ROSC, our adjusted risk ratio is about 1.3. ROSC at ER arrival, about 1.4. Any ROSC, 1.3. Admitted to hospital, those are all 1.3, 1.4. But what I really care about, as I was mentioning before, is not just did they get their pulse back, but were they able to actually make it out of the hospital? Did they make it out of the ICU instead of just giving up, a few days later? And we could see here that adjusted risk ratios, both of those are greater than 2. So we see really significant findings, and that confidence interval is a bit wider, but it doesn't cross 1 at all. So we know this is quite significant. We're quite confident that we do see that these patients that did have more ventilations appear to be in this study to be much more likely to be associated with both survival to hospital discharge with any sort of outcome, and those with good neurological outcome that are able to talk and have have at most minor cognitive deficits. So really cool to see that even though those numbers were even bigger when they were unadjusted, we knew that they'd come down a little bit to earth, but still pretty amazing results to see.
Absolutely. And I agree. I think you focused on the key outcome, which is that neurologically intact survival. But even just looking at the descriptives on that, an 8 percentage point difference is really, really big when it comes to something like cardiac arrest. And then seeing that finding holds true with a 3-fold difference in the risk ratio after controlling for all those confounding variables, it tells us that there's certainly something going on here. I do look at the raw percentage there on the survival, though, and see 11% survival. That's overall been about the same for a really, really, really long time. So if we are to look at some other data sources today, CARES being one of the big data sources we use for cardiac arrest, the overall survival rate really hasn't changed that much since this study period. So we'd like to say, oh, we do things so much better now. maybe we don't, and maybe there's still a lot of room for improvement. So I think this is important context for us to have as well as we think about, well, what are we going to actually do with these findings? And I think they have some interesting figures is the last thing I'll highlight before we dive into discussion and implications. So Jeff, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're looking at in terms of these graphical images in figure 2?
Sure. So these are our dose response curves. And instead of just looking at that binary of whether they're at 50% or greater or less than 50% of pauses having a ventilation, we're actually measuring the average number of ventilations during each of those approximately 12 pauses that they would have, those median 12 pauses. And and this is something that we would expect to see, kind of putting our researcher cap on. We would think that if more ventilations are good, that we would expect to see sort of that rising curve. And we could see that for the most part, our outcomes do look like they improve a bit, especially when it comes to survival. So we see that ventilations per pause, as it moves from 0 to 2 ventilations per pause, we see that curve is rising, meaning greater probability of survival and greater probability of our ROSC and hospital admission. So this, I wouldn't use the word prove, I just said prove. But, this provides more evidence that it seems like there's something going on there with more measurable ventilations definitely being associated with those outcomes, those really good outcomes that we like.
I agree. And I think it's good that the authors included this dose response analysis. So when I think you hinted at it, Jeff, when you said, oh no, I said prove and I didn't mean prove. Establishing causality in a study like this is going to be a really big challenge and typically is not going to happen in an observational look or a secondary analysis of a study like this. But there are these things in epidemiology called Hill's criteria, and these things have to be in place for there to be a causal relationship. So even though we can't prove causality, we can certainly add evidence towards causality, and having something in place like there is actually a dose response relationship is an important one of Hill's criteria. And then of course, something like temporality, the treatment had to come before the outcome. And there's 9 of these criteria, but I do think that this one was an important one to see. And all of those lines go in the same direction, and the finding holds in terms of the direction when we look at the adjusted versus the unadjusted. So all of this is just building a little bit of a stronger argument. But again, not to say that this is causal, but there is, this increased idea of, oh, maybe there is actually something to see here, and we should continue to study this for sure. Now, I think we've covered the main results. So I want to open it back up for discussion, audience and panelists alike. There's so much that I want to dig into here, but I am really interested in thinking about the educator's perspective. So Michael and Bill, I'm gonna lean on you a little bit and ask, what does this mean for us in terms of EMS education?
I was just thinking, if I'm getting CPR done on me, I guess I would like some ventilations to be done. And maybe we measure those ventilations. I think we spend a lot of time measuring chest quality compression. All of our monitors will do it. We have audio and visual feedback devices on our mannequins, but we don't have a lot in terms of measuring actual ventilations. And so I think maybe that's one of my big takeaways is we probably need to pay just as much attention to how we're ventilating when we're doing our CPR rather than just chest quality compression. And that has a direct implication on all of us as educators. We spend time on chest, compression quality, all that stuff matters, when we probably need to do a little bit on ventilation here as well. This whole study brought me back to the, there's a lot of contention out there on BVM size. And about a year ago, we said, okay, the American Heart Association didn't really take a stance on it, but there's lots of research that said like, well, maybe we should be using smaller BVM sizes. Maybe even the kid BVM size will be just as effective in adults. And we made some big changes, I think, across EMS. We said, okay, we're going to switch to these kid-sized BVMs. And this data really suggests maybe that's a little bit forward thinking, and that before we do that, we need to make sure that no matter what size BVM we're using, we're ensuring that we're actually getting good ventilations. That would be my take on it, is we need to probably focus a little bit more on this in terms of education, and maybe we shouldn't throw out our adult BVMs quite yet.
I completely agree. And I think there's so much about ventilation that we haven't considered quite yet. So not only are we delivering an effective ventilation, but how are we delivering it? I would love to see a study that looks at over what duration was that ventilation delivered. Nervous, I don't see a cardiac arrest very often as an individual EMS clinician. It's a relatively rare event in any one clinician's experience. Am I grabbing that bag and squeezing really hard, or am I delivering a slow, controlled breath and releasing? Right. I think these things are also important. And Claude makes some really great comments here in the chat about focusing on that P part of CPR and getting real-time feedback devices. So for a while, we've had compression feedback devices telling us, speed up, slow down in real time, but getting some of these ventilation feedback devices may also help us improve our quality. And I like that approach because it is a systems change. We talk a lot about don't blame the bad clinician, right? This is not a bad Apple problem. It's a system problem. And so designing some of these systems-based solutions could probably change our results. Now, Bill, I'm curious to hear your perspectives.
So I have I'm going to start with what I think is one of our biggest challenges is our current simulation devices do not simulate well what we're trying to do for real people. And particularly in the area of ventilations, in some cases, it's possible to keep the head even flexed forward and be able to deliver a ventilation on a mannequin. So there's a lot of shortcomings there that can develop bad technique, because how you do something, the little things really does make a difference. And you brought up something that I think is important in the sense of, how long does it take you to get that ventilation and how fast are you squeezing the bag, even just, that peak pressure that you run into. I ran across just the other day a really brief study that, most people, they talk that the lower esophageal sphincter will open up at 20 centimeters worth of water. And this was a small but elegant study with just freshly post-cardiac arrest patients that they ran out to the family after they said their goodbyes and everything and got consent to continue to evaluate. And they have found out that it appears that it may open up as little as 5 centimeters, the lower esophagus, which again brings in all of the problems we have when you get a big lot of gas in the belly, restricting the diaphragm. I mean, the thing goes on and on. But I always do think it is how you do train, and many people talk about it. You can't stand there and say, oh, I'm doing CPR by just tapping on the chest. Someone actually needs to be compressing on the chest. Someone needs to be trying to get air in and all these different parts that we sometimes take for granted because we want to get to something that seems a little bit more snazzy, or whether it's putting the tube in, or whether it's defibrillating or putting an IO in or something like that, where it's really paying attention to these details. And I know there was a comment earlier in the ROC personnel, the ROC study did a lot of work to try to standardize out the training before the study took place. There was run-up times into it. A lot of work was done. Was it perfect? No, but there was a great deal of effort paid to training personnel to participate in the ROC study to try to minimize things as much as they possibly can. And I think we don't practice it enough. We just don't practice it enough. And again, there was another eloquent study that I read that talked about really we should be every month. There's no reason now a mannequin can't be in every station that provides feedback, that people can't take 2 minutes and do quality chest compressions at the correct rate, the correct depth, the correct release. These days of waiting once every 2 years is just not applicable. And again, I don't care if you use mechanical devices, you need to practice with the mechanical devices just as much as you do manual CPR. And always remember, the mechanical devices fail and they don't fit everyone. So there's a key role to continue with manual practice. So I love the study. It adds to that body of knowledge, but we need more work, no question about it.
As we operationalize this, something else that comes to mind, actually, I can't remember where I read it, but there was a study that was just out on using a ventilator in cardiac arrest management. And I was initially like, that seems complicated. There's also not a lot of agencies that have that capability. But as more and more agencies and that technology becomes more available, the most ventilators of good technology can actually measure this type of thing. So it sort of makes me start to think, well, actually, that's probably not all bad. The second operational moment that Bill made me think of was, who do we put in charge of BVM in our patients? Usually it's the least experienced person, or maybe even the paramedic or the EMT student. We're like, here, you go BVM ventilate, because we're so focused on all this other stuff, getting the IO, getting the epi, when really our team leader probably needs to focus just as much on high quality ventilations as high quality compressions, right? We teach our team leaders, watch those chest compressions, make sure we limit our off chest time. We probably need to make sure we're doing the same thing for BVM ventilations, and working with who's ever delivering those ventilations to make sure it's not the second thought of like, well, who's ever got the least amount of experience, put them on BVM ventilations because it's something everybody can do. This study demonstrates that's probably not the case.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And then wanted to bring in 2 additional policy perspectives when I was thinking about this study and takeaway points. So we know that cardiac arrest, out of all of our different EMS calls, probably demands some of the most in terms of crew resource management, and having the optimal number of EMS providers and having enough folks that are there that are trained well, that can really focus on all the things that we know can help this patient improve outcomes. And there was a recent study that came out, I believe, a year or 2 ago, looking at the optimal number of EMS providers that was associated with that was associated with cardiac arrest survival. And I believe it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 EMS providers was much more associated, had stronger association with survival compared to fewer EMS providers. And I think some of that, what might be going on is, if we only have one provider who's both bagging and holding that seal, it's really hard to focus on both providing that seal and high quality ventilations. We know that if we have more hands, somebody can dedicate 2 hands solely to maintaining that mask seal, as well as that head tilt chin lift or jaw thrust, and ensuring that that airway is open and patent, and we can deliver high quality ventilations. So I was thinking that this study almost, not explicitly, but almost implicitly, provides argument that we do need some more people there, so we can dedicate extra hands to focusing on airway management. And then the second thing was, if we can't really succeed at BVM ventilation, I mean, that is one of our fundamental skills. I know some of our systems are thinking of taking advanced airways that traditionally were only utilized by maybe paramedics and EMT intermediates or advanced EMTs, and putting those in the hands of EMT basics. So as our supraglottics have become more common and cheaper and easier, we're no longer using EOAs, we're no longer using those combi tube devices and figuring out the colors in which tube. The iGel is super quick, super simple, super straightforward. And increasingly, many systems are allowing their EMT basics, so often the first responders, the firefighters who might be there first on scene, to drop that iGel and then right away to potentially have improved ventilation, since you don't have to worry about that mask seal. I'm curious to look at this study, since it's almost a decade old now, that we have many more supraglottic airway options and iGels, to see what happens next. And thank you, Claude, for your comment. Definitely supraglottic airway devices leak, and they're not always placed perfectly. So we certainly need to make sure that they are placed correctly, and they're not perfect, but I know it's something that we're seeing more and more of.
Absolutely. And I think, this is the perfect thing to go through a driver diagram on and think about which parts of the system are giving rise to some of these results. So why is BVM ventilation so hard? Well, I don't have giant hands, and it is really hard for me to do the C and the E, or whichever ventilation or mask seal strategy we want to go with. C and E was the best for me, but that's a real challenge, and especially when there's other things going on and people want you to hand them something. And then you brought up the point about who else is on scene. If it's just me and a partner, this is going to be a real big challenge. to get that good seal consistently and to stay focused. So I think Bill highlighted a bunch of this too, but this is an area where we might see technology innovations coming into play and helping a lot. So a couple of different things that these innovations might address is one, how we're delivering that breath. I know there's some devices now that are limiting the peak pressure. So if I squeeze the bag really hard, nothing's going to happen. I have to squeeze it slow, deliberate, but the release on the bag is also really important, how fast I let go. And I think some of these other devices around measurement are going to become important, because when we talk about quality management of these, how do we review these as agency leaders? Well, we actually have to measure it to see if we need to improve it. And I think this hasn't been consistently part of our measurement. It's becoming more consistent, which I find encouraging. When we do our code reviews, we can now start to see some of the ventilation measures. But this is a key place to focus on. And sometimes it's really tempting to go focus on a shiny new toy, like, oh, I want to go get ECMO, ultrasound, you name it, right? Like, we're going for all these things, but really there's some basic things that might actually lead to even bigger positive results. So not forgetting that. And I want to highlight a comment that Claude had in here too, around that we really need to train like we play. So if we're not using mannequins with sealed lungs and not really, if we're allowing ourselves to simulate everything instead of doing it, when the time comes and we're running on stress and adrenaline, and we're going to revert back to our muscle memory. So having trained like we play is really a key piece here. And then just recognizing that we don't do manual ventilation very well, especially when it comes to our pediatric patients, which is an even higher stress scenario in a lot of ways. I think that's another key point to highlight here. And also brings up this idea of that Steve had here, is there a place for mechanical ventilation? The devices are changing, they're getting easier to use in the pre-hospital setting. And especially, if we're going to be transporting after we get ROSC, should we be thinking about incorporating mechanical ventilation? And at what level should we be incorporating that? I think there is a ton of implications for this, and I hope it sparks more research, because there's still certainly a lot that we don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the authors did a fairly good job when they talk about their future work, talking about kind of where this could go in the future and how they could do these measures in a more consistent way. And they talk about some equipment or measurement equipment that's been recently released to look at ventilations, portable spirometer, and just the fact that the replicating is right. All research, you want to be able to replicate it, and you want to be able to see, does your results match what was previously published? I think that replicating this would be a fantastic idea, particularly if there's more easier ways to measure ventilation, not just relying on a handful of available defibrillators.
I totally agree. And now I know that we're rounding out some of our time here, but I'm going to leave time for a couple last comments. I know Bill's he's got his hand up. Let's go. What you got for us?
You touched on it, and I want to touch on it again, is about all this other stuff. There is a cognitive overload that can take place at the scene of a cardiac arrest. And it is probably, again, the value of checklists come into play, but also focusing on the stuff that we know really works and prioritizing that and focusing on that. And then we can worry about some of this other stuff that might have a role, but we still don't know what it is. And the other thing is I think this paper does an excellent job of telling us, where do we need to be studying in the future?
Totally agree. We've got time for any last comments from our panelists before I have that unpopular test that is coming.
My final takeaway is one, great job by the authors, and I always appreciate them sharing, especially topics that we don't always look at that make us all go, and my second sort of key takeaway is make sure your mannequins have good chest rise and fall. We train on them all the time, and I think oftentimes that's one of the things I see lacking the most is like, oh, just pretend that you have good chest rise and fall, when most mannequins are pretty easy to actually fix. Why they don't have good chest, it's usually pretty easy to fix. So it's one of the things that I we focus on a lot in our classrooms is making sure we have good chest rise and fall in our mannequins, make sure the lungs work, make sure they're there, make sure they don't leak. That's my big takeaway from this.
Huge takeaways, and that this is not just initial education, this is continuing education. I think Bill and Jeff both spoke to the idea of skill fade, and that, you know, this isn't something that we should just come in and do once a year.
I think a big takeaway from this study as well is just back to the basics, focusing on the basics. I feel like we have so many studies in cardiac arrest that have shown now that it's really those things like rapid recognition, high quality CPR, rapid early defibrillation, all skills that are within the scope of practice of an EMT basic. And yes, paramedics have more tools that they're able to utilize, but when it comes to our actual outcomes and survival to hospital discharge with good neurological outcome, just ventilations, BVM ventilations can really make such a huge difference that I think this study is yet another study showing how critical the roles of EMTs are in our EMS system.
Absolutely. Tony, any last words from you before I take us out?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Michael said earlier. I mean, kudos to the authors for finding a new niche to examine that we weren't necessarily thinking about. I think that this is great, and certainly the best research, right, is going to lead to more questions, and I think this certainly did. I'm looking forward to seeing some studies that replicate these methods and see what we find. But yeah, congratulations to the authors. This is a really interesting study and a fantastic analysis.
Absolutely, and so much more for us to consider. And I'll get to have the last word. I think one of the key takeaways for me was, the need to actually measure and look at this. I bet if we would have asked these 6 participating sites how well and effective they were delivering ventilations, none of them would have guessed that in approximately half of these cases, we were not delivering an effective intervention in at least 50% of the pauses, right? So I think not being afraid to look at your data and not just assuming that everything is okay can be a powerful change mechanism. And I really appreciate all of you panelists for sharing your time with us, and especially you, the audience. It is really great to see all of this participation in the chat. Thank you so much again. And I hope that you will come join us for an upcoming event. Just as a reminder, we've got the education version of this research podcast on Friday, March 22nd. And then we'll be back here second Monday of the month, which will be April 8th. For the clinical version of this podcast. So I want to thank everybody again for sharing your time with us, and we look forward to catching you on the next one.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website, prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsors, Limmer Education, providing educational tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey, and ESO, dedicated to improving community health and safety through the power of data.